The trust is valid. The amendment checks out. County records confirm everything. Legally, your husband has no authority to remove you from that property. None. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in over a week. Relief, yes, but underneath it, something heavier. 29 years, and my husband hadn't understood, or hadn't cared to understand, who actually held the deed to the life we'd built. There's a second issue, Sandra continued, sliding the loan document toward me. This concerns me more. Tell me. Your agency is structured as a legal partnership. Your name is on the founding documents, added when the company restructured 9 years ago, which means your husband pledged shared assets as collateral without the consent of his business partner. Me, I said slowly. I'm the partner. You're the partner, she confirmed. I sat back, absorbing it. For years, I'd let everyone, clients, neighbors, even myself, call it Richard's business. The truth had been sitting in a drawer of paperwork the whole time, waiting for someone to actually look. What happens now? I asked. Sandra folded her hands. Now we wait for him to make his next move. And when he does, we'll be ready. The days that followed were nothing like the movies make betrayal look. There was no dramatic confrontation, no scene at a restaurant, just paperwork, phone calls, long nights compiling bank statements and tax records at my kitchen table while the house sat quiet around me. Former clients started calling once word got around, quietly, the way news travels in a small business community. A landscaping contractor named Gary Boone, whom I'd personally walked through a brutal audit years earlier, called just to say, "You kept my business alive in 2014. Whatever you need, count on me." I hadn't realized how many people had been paying attention all along. Meanwhile, Richard seemed blissfully unaware that anything was wrong. Carol kept me updated with the enthusiasm of someone live blogging a parade. Vanessa had ordered new patio furniture. Vanessa had booked a caterer. And then, the detail that made even Carol pause mid-sentence. Richard had scheduled a housewarming party for the Saturday after they returned from the coast. Neighbors, clients, old friends, all invited to celebrate what the invitation called a fresh start. A marriage had quietly ended, and somehow it had become an occasion for cocktail napkins. Thursday morning, Sandra called with news that made my stomach flip. "We have final confirmation on the trust. It's airtight, and the business documentation supports everything we suspected." "So what happens now?" "Now," she said, "we let him walk into his own mistake. Not to humiliate him, but the truth has to surface somewhere, and it might as well be somewhere it can't be denied." I understood, even if the plan made my hands tremble as I signed the authorization paperwork later that day. Not from fear, from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of making a major decision entirely on my own for the first time in decades. "You can still change your mind," Sandra said gently. I thought about Tuesday night, about being given 4 days to vacate a home my own father had protected for me, about Vanessa's paint swatches in what used to be my living room. "No," I said. "Let's do this." Saturday arrived warm and bright, the kind of spring day that pulls the whole neighborhood outside. By 10 that morning, a locksmith was standing in my kitchen, methodically replacing every lock in the house. Even watching it happen, some part of me still couldn't quite believe it was real. Not because it was wrong, everything had been reviewed and approved down to the last signature. The trust controlled the property. I was the named beneficiary. Richard had no legal standing to remove me. He simply hadn't known it. The locksmith handed me a fresh set of keys around noon. I stood in the living room afterward, sunlight pouring across the same hardwood floors Richard and I had installed together 15 years earlier, and instead of triumph, I mostly felt tired, worn thin by the weight of everything it had taken to get here. Carol arrived not long after with a tray of deviled eggs for morale. By early afternoon, Sandra had arrived too, along with a process server and a representative from the Trust Administration office. Everything was handled calmly, professionally. Sealed legal notices affixed to the front door explaining the property's status, and a second packet addressing the outstanding business concerns. Word travels fast on a quiet street. By 5, half the neighborhood had somehow heard something was happening. Carol considered spreading the news a form of public service. At 7:40, headlights swept across the driveway. The room went still. Through the front window, I watched a car pull up. Richard first, then Vanessa, both dressed for a weekend away, both completely unprepared for what waited on the other side of that door. Richard climbed the porch steps holding a bouquet of lilies he must have picked up on the drive home, already smiling, already reaching for keys that no longer worked. He tried the lock once, twice. Then he noticed the sealed envelope taped beside the door, pulled it free, and began to read. I watched his expression shift in real time, confusion, then concern, then something closer to panic. "What is it?" Vanessa asked, leaning over his shoulder. He didn't answer. He just kept reading, his face draining of color, the flowers slipping from his hand. Then he looked up, past the porch, past the windows, and found me standing calmly on the other side of the glass. "No," he said, then louder. "No, this isn't real. Tell me this isn't real." The exact words that opened this story. He rushed the door, pulling at a handle that wouldn't give. Vanessa grabbed the papers from his hand and read faster, her expression sliding from confusion to disbelief to something sharper. "You told me this house was yours," she said. "Let me explain. You told me the business was yours too." By then, several neighbors had drifted closer, purely by coincidence, of course. Sandra stepped out onto the porch beside me, calm as ever, and handed Richard a second folder, the one detailing the loan, the undisclosed liabilities, the partnership he'd apparently forgotten I was legally part of. Vanessa read halfway through before she lowered the papers, looked at Richard for a long moment, and said simply, "Are you serious?" He had no answer for her. He'd never really had one for me either. She got back into the car alone and drove away, leaving Richard standing on a porch that wasn't his, holding documents that told the truth for the first time in over a year, surrounded by people who now knew exactly what kind of year it had been. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. 3 days later, Richard called and asked to meet. I let it ring twice before answering. Not to punish him. I just needed a moment to steady myself. "I'd like to talk," he said. "About everything." We met at a small coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground. The kind of place where nobody pays attention to anyone else's business. He looked smaller somehow when he sat down across from me. Not physically, but in some quieter way I couldn't quite name. "I deserve everything that's happened," he said, before I'd even asked a question. That wasn't what I expected. I'd braced for excuses. Instead, for the first time in a long while, I got something close to honesty. "What happened to you?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, and I believed him because people rarely destroy their lives in one dramatic moment. Usually it happens slowly, one small compromise at a time, one lie justified by another, until they wake up somewhere they never meant to be. He told me about Vanessa, about the year of small decisions that became one large one. He told me, finally, that the business had never been his alone, that he'd let people believe otherwise because it was easier than admitting how much he depended on me. He told me my father had never fully trusted him, and that after my father passed, something in him had started drifting. "Do you hate me?" he asked eventually. I thought about it honestly before answering. No. That didn't mean I'd forgotten what he'd done, or that I trusted him, or that any of it was suddenly fine. It just meant the anger had stopped being useful to carry. "I don't want the house," he said quietly. "I know it was never really mine." "Good," I said. "I'm sorry, Diane." 29 years passed through my mind in the space of that sentence. The tiny apartment we started in, our son's first steps, ordinary Tuesdays, arguments long forgotten, a whole shared life. The apology didn't undo any of it, but it was real, and that mattered more than I expected it to. I know, I said, and I did. The legal matters took several more months to fully settle. The business was divided fairly, the outstanding loans addressed, the paperwork eventually, finally, closed. Life moved forward the way real healing usually does, slowly, unglamorously, one ordinary day at a time. These days, nearly 3 years later, I still sit on that same back porch some mornings with my coffee, in the same house my father quietly protected decades before I ever understood why. The garden is thriving. Carol still shows up uninvited with more food than any one person could eat. And every so often, I spend an afternoon at the community center helping other women understand the paperwork that shapes their lives, trusts, wills, ownership, the kind of documents I once let someone else read for me. If there's one thing I carried out of that spring, it's this. Strength doesn't always announce itself with a scene or a slammed door. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear quietly when someone else has decided your worth for you. And sometimes the truest kind of justice isn't loud at all. It's just a life, rebuilt calmly, on ground that was always rightfully yours. This isn't real. Tell me this isn't real. Those were the first words my husband said when he stood on our porch with his golf bag still in the trunk and his new fiancée gripping a bouquet of white lilies beside him. The flowers fell first, then his phone. Neither of them noticed. I stood behind the glass storm door in my bathrobe, holding a folder against my chest, and for the first time in 29 years of marriage, I felt completely calm. But to understand why Richard Coleman looked like the ground had opened beneath him on a warm Saturday evening in April, you need to go back exactly 9 days. Back to a Tuesday dinner. Back to the night everything I thought I knew fell apart. My name is Diane Coleman. I'm 56 years old, and until that spring, I believed I understood the shape of my life completely. I lived in a quiet cul-de-sac outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a brick colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden I'd spent 2 decades getting exactly right. I made the same coffee every morning, waved to the same mail carrier, and for nearly 3 decades, I was married to the same man. I thought I knew him. I was wrong. That Tuesday began like 100 others. I spent the morning doing the books for our family insurance agency, Coleman Risk Partners, though everyone just called it Richard's company. I'd handled the claims processing, the client files, and half the underwriting decisions since the year our son started kindergarten. Nobody ever asked whose name was actually on the founding paperwork. I never brought it up either. I liked the quiet certainty of being needed, even if nobody said it out loud. Around 6, I made dinner, roast chicken, the kind Richard used to request on his birthday when we were young and broke and happy in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. He came home at 7, later than usual, and he barely met my eyes when he sat down. "Rough day?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He set his fork down before he'd even picked it up. That was the first sign something had shifted. Richard never skipped a meal for conversation. "Diane," he said, "we need to talk." I remember the exact moment because a rerun of the local evening news was murmuring behind him, something about road construction on the interstate. Ordinary background noise for what was about to become the least ordinary night of my life. "Okay," I said. "Vanessa is moving in next month." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain refused to process it as a real sentence. "I'm sorry. Who?" "Vanessa Pierce, from the marketing conference." He said her name like I should already know it, like he'd mentioned her before, though I was certain I hadn't. Then I remembered. A photo from a company retreat 8 months earlier. A tall woman in a red dress standing a little too close to my husband in the background of somebody else's vacation post. "You're joking," I said. "I'm not." "How long?" "A year, about a year." A year, 365 days of a life I hadn't known. I was living inside a lie. I sat there while the kitchen clock ticked, and Richard kept talking about needing to be honest with himself, about not wasting the years he had left, about how Vanessa made him feel like he was 35 again. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in his car on the drive home. Then came the part that actually knocked the air out of me. "I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay. Give me, some space to figure this out." "This is my house too, Richard." He shook his head slowly, almost gently, like he was breaking bad news to a child. "The house is in my name, Diane. It has been since we bought it. I checked with the attorney already." "You checked with an attorney? About kicking me out of my own home?" "I'd like you out by the end of the week. Friday, if you can manage it." Friday, 29 years distilled into 4 days. I looked past him at the wall of family photographs, our son's graduation, our 25th anniversary trip to the coast, a lifetime of ordinary Sundays, and I felt something strange settle over me. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter, something almost like clarity. "If that's what you want," I said. Richard blinked, clearly thrown by how easily I'd agreed. He'd expected tears, or shouting, or a scene he could point to later as proof that leaving me had been the reasonable choice. Instead, he got calm, and calm made him careless. That night, once he was asleep, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went up to the attic, looking for old photo albums. I told myself I just needed something familiar to hold on to. What I found instead was a metal strongbox, tucked behind a box of Christmas ornaments, with my maiden name written across the lid in my father's blocky handwriting. My father had been dead for 11 years. I sat on the attic floor with that box in my lap, listening to Richard's breathing through the ceiling below, steady, undisturbed, a man sleeping soundly after upending his wife's entire existence. The box wasn't locked. That was very much like my father, Walter Hensley, a man who trusted a hiding place more than he trusted a lock. Inside were folders, a faded envelope from a downtown law office, and paperwork I didn't fully understand at first glance. My father had been an accountant his whole working life, cautious to the point of stubbornness. When Richard and I bought this house 30 years ago, my father had quietly covered nearly a third of the down payment. I remembered him sitting at our old kitchen table saying, "This is for you both, but mostly it's for my daughter's peace of mind." I'd laughed it off at the time. At 56, sitting alone in a dusty attic, I wasn't laughing. The first document was the original closing paperwork. Buried in the language was a phrase that stopped my heart: Hensley Family Property Trust. The house had never been purchased outright by Richard and me as a couple. It had been placed into a trust my father established, naming me, not Richard, as the primary beneficiary. I read it 3 times before I trusted my own eyes. I carried the box downstairs before dawn and sat at the kitchen table with black coffee, going through page after page until the sun came up. When Richard wandered in around 7, already halfway into his morning routine, he glanced at the boxes I'd started stacking by the door. "Good," he said. "You're getting a head start." "I am," I said, and meant something entirely different than he did. "What are your plans this weekend?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Vanessa and I are going down to the coast, back next Saturday." Of course, a romantic getaway while I packed away 3 decades of my life. "That works out well," I said, and smiled into my coffee cup. The moment he left for the office, I called the number on the old law firm's envelope. Disconnected, unsurprisingly, the attorney who drafted the trust would have been well into his 80s by now, if he was even still alive. A little searching led me to a firm on Tryon Street that had absorbed his old files years earlier. By 10:30 that morning, I was sitting in their lobby holding my father's strongbox like it was a life raft. The attorney who took my case was a sharp, unhurried woman named Sandra Ruiz, with reading glasses perched on top of gray-streaked hair and the patience of someone who had heard every version of the story before. She spent nearly 40 minutes going through the documents in silence, while I sat across from her, holding my breath. Finally, she looked up. "Mrs. Coleman, I want to verify a few things with the county before I say this with total certainty, but based on what's in front of me, your husband may not actually have the authority to remove you from this property." I gripped the arms of my chair. "He said the house was in his name." "It's titled to the trust," she said. "Your father structured it that way specifically so the home couldn't be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without your consent. You and your husband have lived there as beneficiaries of that trust for 30 years. That's very different from ownership." "He was careful," I murmured. "He was thorough," Sandra said, and something in her tone told me she approved. "There's an amendment referenced here that we'll need to track down. It should be in county records, but I want the original if you have it." "I'll find it," I said, though I had no idea where to start. "Until then," Sandra told me, "don't move out. Don't sign anything he brings you. And don't tell him what we've discussed." That last instruction proved harder than expected, because when I came home that afternoon, Richard was in the living room with a tape measure, sizing up the wall where our wedding portrait had hung for 2 decades. "Vanessa has a sectional," he explained, not even looking embarrassed. "Bigger than what we have now." I didn't say a word. I just walked past him into the garage and started sorting through boxes of my father's old files, because if Walter Hensley had been careful enough to protect the house, I had a feeling he hadn't stopped there. My neighbor, Carol Whitfield, found me in the garage 2 days later, elbow deep in a filing cabinet, surrounded by dust and old insurance folders. Carol was 71, a retired schoolteacher, and she had never in her life let a piece of gossip pass by unexamined. "Tell me you are not actually leaving," she said, setting down a plate of lemon bars on top of a box marked kitchen. I told her enough, not everything, just enough. And she listened without interrupting, which for Carol was practically a miracle. "Well," she finally said, "that man always did dress like his personality was ironed flat." I laughed for the first time in days, hard enough that I had to sit down on an overturned crate. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Mostly I need someone to remind me I haven't lost my mind." "Honey," Carol said, patting my shoulder, "people who've lost their minds don't organize garage boxes by category. You're fine, better than fine." Over the following days, Carol appointed herself my unofficial lookout, delivering casseroles, updates from the neighborhood group chat, and once, mysteriously, a set of bolt cutters I never asked for and never used. Vanessa, meanwhile, had started posting on social media. Photos of paint swatches, a caption about new beginnings, a picture of herself standing in what she clearly believed would soon be her living room. It stung more than I expected. Not just the betrayal, the erasure. Watching someone plan a future in the exact rooms where I had raised a family felt like being written out of my own story while I was still standing in it. Late one night, digging through the last of my father's old filing cabinet, I found a blue folder tucked behind a stack of receipts from a hardware store that had closed 20 years earlier. Inside was the original trust amendment, signed, notarized, exactly what Sandra needed. And tucked behind it, something I hadn't expected, a business loan document with Richard's signature on it, dated 18 months earlier, using company assets as collateral. Assets that belonged to both of us, on paper I had never seen and never signed. I sat on the concrete floor of that garage and read it twice, my hands unsteady, my mind racing through implications I didn't fully understand yet. The house wasn't the only thing Richard had gotten wrong, and he was about to find that out. Monday morning, 3 days after Richard left for the coast, I sat across from Sandra Ruiz in a conference room with a view of the Charlotte skyline. She'd spread every document across the table in neat, organized rows. The house, she said, tapping the trust paperwork, is actually the simple part. Simple?